So humans are very unique, a unique aspect of God's creation. Modern science, or at least non-Christian science, wants to communicate that we are just sort of higher evolved animals, that we have bigger brains and sort of more advanced, but we're really just part of the process. But the Bible says that we're entirely unique. We're different. We're separate from the rest of creation, created in a different, unique way. And we are, as humans, we tend to not respond well to rules, for the most part. I mean, there are some humans that like everything clear, black and white. They want, all the rules listed and everything's just simply, it's either this way or that way. But for most people, I think it tends to be a little bit more gray. And I was driving into Seattle last week, actually last Sunday for Mother's Day. Got to watch Bowie play soccer, which is a fascinating event for kids this high. But here's what I was noticing. We were driving, the speed limit from here to Seattle is 60 miles an hour. And, I tend to drive about 65 probably. If you drive 65 on I-5 now, you feel like you're sitting still. I mean, people were flying past me. They must have been doing 75 or 80. And, there's this natural part of us that just kind of wants to push the edge and to say, is that really a rule or where is that is? And I was thinking about the number one response that our mothers give to us when we say, why? Because I said so, right? So there is one component that makes us want to follow the rules, and that is fear. When you're in a situation where there's fear, you want to know exactly how things are going to happen. For example, someone tells you, rattlesnakes can't strike at you unless they're coiled. Well, that's good information to know. If a rattlesnake crossing your path, you probably won't get bit unless it takes the time to coil itself. There's probably some exceptions to that, but at least, in a fearful situation, we want to know exactly how everything's going to happen. And so traditionally, in the church, we have often used fear to get people to conform to the behavior that God asks of us, and whether that's current disasters or eternal hell, that's the factor. But there's this natural part of us that when we hear that rule, immediately go, well, why? And we don't see God. He's not here anywhere. I don't know where he is. So it's really easy for us to think, well, do those things really matter? Is that really important? And so there's always been a challenge to living the Christian walk from that perspective. And fascinating to me that when Jesus entered the scene, he entered a scene in which everything was very, very much black and white. I mean, the religious leaders had things down to minutia as far as how you were supposed to behave. And these are the rules, these are regulations, this is how you perform. And there was some fear associated. They would attach fear to it. In fact, you could be excommunicated from society, which was pretty terrifying if you didn't follow these rules and regulations. But Jesus steps into the scene and he immediately begins to sort of challenge things. And some of the rules he said are not that important. And what he starts to communicate to is that there's something more important than living by the rules, and that's living by the principles. And there are underlying principles that the rules reflect. And the rules are important, but only because they reveal to us the underlying principles as to why our behavior matters in a certain way. And I want to talk to you this morning actually specifically, kind of looking around to make sure, see who all's here, but I want to talk to you actually about sexuality, human sexuality, and our cultural response to human sexuality and how our day and age views it, and that even within the church, how that's prevalent. And fascinatingly, I think it was about 20 years that I'm trying to remember when this all took place, but about 20 years ago, there was this movement, this purity movement, where parents would give their children a purity ring or a purity, remember those? And honestly, I hope this isn't true, but it seemed like it was primarily the young ladies. I really hope that wasn't true, but it may have been, sadly. And sadly and unfortunately, historically, I think there has probably been a little bit more weight given to the women being, stressing purity than the men. We just sort of ignore them, and that's horrible and horrific. But I think that's what's true. But here's the fascinating thing. They've done studies since then, and they discovered that those kids that entered into the purity agreements have a higher propensity of engaging in pre-sexual behavior than those that don't. Isn't that ironic? And so the person that was talking about this said, maybe what we should have done was encouraged our kids to tell them if they had to have sex, and then they wouldn't have. I mean, obviously we're not going to do that, but yeah. Anyway, I want to take you to a story this morning in the New Testament, and I want to talk about some underlying principles for sexual morality and sexual purity, and in encouraging that not only in our young people, but actually in our lives as well. Because I think it's very easy for us to think of people who are younger and think that there's an issue there, but statistically we know that the issue is pretty much in everyone, in all of our lives. So the story is in the Gospel of John, and it starts out at the end of the 7th chapter. So if you want to turn there, you can, or I'm just going to read the story to you. And I'm going to give you a minute to turn there. So it's from 7:53 through 8:11. And this is a very, very common story. I mean, if you've been in the church at all, you've heard the story, and I've probably preached from it. There have been hundreds of sermons, thousands of sermons probably preached about it. Unfortunately, there is some question as to whether or not this actually happened. I should just put a disclaimer here. In the earliest manuscripts, this story is not there. Not to pop your bubble because it's a great story, but it may not have existed. But I'm still going to preach from it because it's there. So it's a great story, and I think there's a great illustration in the story that I want to talk to you about a couple of things. So here's the story. I guess it sort of starts at verse 2. At dawn he appeared again before the temple courts where all the people gathered around him. He sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." And there, lots of sermons have been preached, and they look at different aspects. For example, one of the first questions that's always raised is, where's the guy? Because obviously if she was involved in adultery, she wasn't by herself. There was another party of this, but he's missing. So there's that whole component. And let me just pause for a minute and make a statement about sexual morality and lust. I can recall clear back to when I was in adolescence, this idea that somehow women were responsible for the lust of men. That, if you dressed a certain way, or you act a certain way, or you perform a certain way, that somehow you are responsible. And they use that verse horribly that says, "Don't cause your brother to stumble." And let me just say that if you're a guy and you're lusting, it is your responsibility. It is your fault. You cannot blame that on anyone else. I don't care if women come in here naked and you lust after them. It's not their fault, all right? don't try to push that on somebody else. So that's sort of a side note there, but I just want to clarify that. So just accept the blame or the blame learned. It's in your heart. It's in your mind. It's not someone else's. And I'll kind of come back to that in a little bit later. But all right, so the other thing that comes up is that, so here's this group of men, and Jesus is writing on the ground. And everybody wants to know, what is he writing on the ground? No one knows, but people have come up with hypotheses that he was writing little names or instances that people would read them and they would go, oh my gosh, he knows about that? And then they would be convicted and they think, I don't want him to mention that, so I'm leaving, I'm getting out of here. But we really don't know. But what I want to talk to you about is in the very end, what Jesus says to her. He says, go and sin no more. But the word sin there actually isn't referring to an action. It's referring to a philosophy, a way of thinking. And I think what Jesus is encouraging her, really, and I might be somewhat reading between the lines, I might be taking a little bit out of context, but I think he's encouraging her to change the principles, change the foundation of your thinking about sexuality. And I think that we need to readdress the issue of sexuality, and it's something that the church doesn't like to talk about. It's a little bit embarrassing, and we don't want to mention it, but I think that we need to go back and look at exactly what it is and why God does have these regulations, these rules. Why does he have this stipulation that seems so narrow? And we live in a world and a society that says, you know what, sexual intimacy is just like a massage or a good back rub or having your feet washed. It's just something physical. You can just enjoy it. But the Bible says, no, it's something more than that. And there are two aspects of this that I want to talk to you about. I really enjoy nature. I really enjoy creation. And one of my favorite animals are ravens. And I appreciate the fact that the queen keeps ravens in the tower. And there's some mythology there that if the ravens leave the tower, the whole country will fall. You've heard that theory. And even during World War II, they kept ravens in the tower because they don't really believe it, but there's this myth that if the tower falls and the ravens leave, then the whole country will leave. Anyway, all that to say, I have an affinity with ravens, but particularly I have an affinity with Australian ravens. And the reason for that is because Australian ravens mate for life. And there's other groups of birds and species that mate for life, but they do. Also, our geese, local geese, mate for life. And I think that God can teach us lessons through nature and can teach us things about ourselves through nature. And I believe that when God put that into the hearts, into the minds of those beasts, it was a way for him to tell us that we also should have that type of mindset. When I first found Christ and when I was first early days of my marriage, one of the things that every young person struggles with, every young man struggles with, is sexual purity and in your thoughts, in your thought life. And it seemed like an insurmountable task to me. And I remember reading about geese and that they mated for life. And I began to pray and seek God about it. And what I clearly heard God say to me is that he designed us to be that exactly same way. That he designed us that if we do end up with a mate, that mate will be our mate for life. And so I began to ask God to transform my thinking. And over a process of many, many years, God began to change the wiring in my brain so that I became less and less interested in having any kind of relationship with anyone else. And I can easily say to you with 99% certainty that I have absolutely no interest in having a relationship with any other women. Wouldn't matter how they came dressed in, wouldn't matter if they all came in, however, just doesn't interest me. And if somehow the men on this planet and the women on this planet could have their minds reformed in that way, it would completely eliminate pornography. There'd be no prostitution. There would be no child abuse. There'd be no, you just think of the impact that would have on our planet if we could come back to the design God created us to. And I believe that's possible. And I believe that we shouldn't allow ourselves to simply say, this is the way God made me. I can't help it when I look at women and I lust after them, but that's just the way God made me. And I want to say to you, no, that's not the way God made you. That's your default mechanism. And a lot of that has to do with societal, simply telling you that's normal. That's the way you are. Yep, that's how we just are like rabbits. We just mate with whatever's out there, our cats, our dogs. And I want to say to you, no, you know what? You're unique. You are special. God made you in a way that your mind can be transformed and you can be shaped and you can have victory over that part of your life. For me, it was a matter of fasting and praying one day a week, and it took years, literally did, but eventually came to the place where that was victorious in my life. And I think the key to that was that as I realized victory over the addiction to food, that was able to translate itself into other addictions as well, of which, sexuality is an addiction for the vast majority of humans. So that's one component. I think you should not be content with how you are. You should say, God, I want my mind to be like a raven or a goose. And in fact, at the time, that was my prayer. Every morning I'd say, God, give me the mind of a goose. So I got it. I have a goose mind. I only want to think of, and it isn't a diminishing of that drive. Drive's just there, it's still great, but now it's just for one person, one woman. The other aspect of this that I think is so important and that we need to teach our young people and to ourselves is that we are unique in that we have a soul. There's no other creation on our planet that has a soul. And, I don't want to offend anybody here, but those of you who have animals and don't have children, I'm happy for you to have an animal, but having a dog or a cat is not the same as having the privilege of bringing another soul into the world, onto this planet. God has given us this amazing, unique opportunity, some of us, and I'm not in any way saying that it's something that everybody needs to experience, but he has given us the ability to engage with him in the creation of a living soul. And that is incredibly special. Humans aren't just like cats and dogs. They are beings with souls. And that soul lives for eternity. And sexual intimacy is, in a way, a connection to God in the creation of a soul. And every time you engage in that, there's the mystery of that involved. And so there has incredible, deep significance to sexual intimacy. It's not just a massage. It is the touching of two souls. There's this phrase that we use, soulmates. And I don't think that God, I don't know, I'm skeptical of the idea that there's one soulmate for every person or for every person that ends up with a soulmate. I think that, God leads you to people that seems like it might work. But once you become married to someone and you end up in that situation, your lives are touched in a way that will never happen again. Sexual intimacy is something incredibly spiritual and soul-like. Now, I was also thinking about people who never marry and don't have that opportunity. And I don't believe God intends every person to have that experience. I think that there are experiences that single people have that I will never have. I have a relative who's my age, and she can go places at a whim. And she can just drop what she's doing and go places, and she does stuff, and she engages in stuff, and she never has to worry about being home on time. Her life is completely her own. She has no parameters around it. And God is able to use her in ways that he can never use me. And so there is something unique and special and wonderful about being single, or maybe even a couple without children. So it isn't that that's better or worse, but it's different. But for all of us, we need to understand that sexuality is something incredibly deep, incredibly profound. I almost said profane. Incredibly profound. And that we need to recognize it as that. We need to ask God to transform our minds, our thinkings about it. And the rules are fine, but they are only there to give us the parameters of this deep, deep, wonderful, amazing principle of the responsibility and the depth that we have available to us as spiritual beings connecting with other spiritual beings. Stand with me. Let me pray for you.